Retro Future.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It is I, Dankert Lexicon, and welcome to a new episode of the Steampunk Beginner's Guide. Yes, it has been a while. Considering we recently went on the Dieselpunk train, I thought it might be a good idea to finally dedicate one of our episodes to this topic. Now, I'm not gonna lie, originally this was going to be a video on using Dieselpunk as a world-building tool. Instead, I went on speculating on the origins of Dieselpunk, and not in a, oh, this guy came up with the term kind of way, because that is a really underwhelming story, but rather how this aesthetic came into being. The easy answer would have been, they combined the aesthetics of World War II with that of science fiction, but I don't think it is that simple. And that's why I will focus this video on the origins of the Dieselpunk aesthetic and how it relates to steampunk. But why do I keep referring to it as an aesthetic? Well, it's because I don't believe there's such a thing as the Dieselpunk story genre. Oh, daring! How dare I say such a thing? But nobody ever been able to mention a single piece of media that isn't pulp or 1950s sci-fi. Whenever defenders of the Dieselpunk genre need to use Lovecraft, Indiana Jones, or Sky Captain as examples, you know we're scraping the bottom of the barrel. Is Dieselpunk truly an aesthetic separate from steampunk though? There, I can see an actual argument, and that is what we'll be discussing today. However, I cannot explain this without explaining the steampunk aesthetic, which I have already done in various videos, but let's recap for those who are new to the series. But first, if you enjoy such deep dives in retrofuturism and sci-fi world building and design, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. First, a word to our sponsors, our members on Ream, and those who are buying our books and comics about the Association of Ishtar. All our income is currently spent on illustrators who make the illustrations for our books and videos. So want to help us develop our take on Dieselpunk and Steampunk? Please consider supporting us on Ream today, or buy our books and other merch on Gumroad. This will also help us improve the art of our alternate history series and make the Association of Ishtar one of the most extensive steampunk settings yet. Also, we're trying something new. Book funnel promotions, where you can get special offers on your favorite genre. Link in the comments below. Now on with the show. So, to recap, steampunk can refer to one of three things: a genre, an aesthetic, and a costume community. Regardless of the category, the aesthetic mixes tropes of popular history with those of contemporary pop culture, sci-fi in particular. But what about the steam in steampunk you scream at the screen? I don't care, because I can't hear you. And anyway, it was a metaphor for the 19th century. The punk was a reference to cyberpunk. It wasn't meant to describe an aesthetic, but it does now, and we are stuck with it. This is why I want to address two very common presumptions that annoy me. First, whenever people discuss the difference between the whatever punks, they post this image. There is this weird rule that the whatever punks are somehow labeled by period. I don't know why or how this is in any way practical. The primary reason is that there's nothing I've seen that can neatly fit in any of these so-called genres that, quite frankly, I'm not confident really exist. This whole train of logic stems from the fact people have no clue on what they're talking about. As far as I can tell, somebody on the internet came up with these names, and retroactively people started coming up with descriptors of things that already were part of pre-existing genres, like Gurnsbeckian science fiction is now getting called Atompunk, or Mad Max being Dieselpunk, because apparently people never heard of post-apocalyptic fiction before. Here's a question for you. Do you enjoy Dieselpunk? Do you know the differences and similarities between these three objects? If not, here's a video on the topic I recommend you watch next. My point is that there is nothing new in these images. It are adoptions of well-defined styles with philosophies and techniques behind them that deserve further investigation. Instead, people refer to it as dieselpunk for no other reason than because it was shown on these reductive images at one point. This suggests that aesthetics have a monopoly on certain tropes. I had somebody try to convince me that because an image had a 1940s car and a zeppelin, it was blending steampunk and dieselpunk. Really now? No genre has a monopoly on aesthetics. There can be fantasy settings with steampunk aesthetics and a steampunk story that can be very light on the goth in brown fashion, which is more related to gaslamp fantasy anyway, but I digress. I suppose it's fine for a layman with passing interest or a shorthand for a creative to get a conversation started like, hey, do you like dieselpunk? Then you'll like the Casket Girls. But this is the beginning of the conversation. A buzzword you can include in a Kickstarter title or enhance your SEO. However, on the internet, there is where the dialogue ends. And that it is lack of online nuance why aesthetics have become memes. This is how you get these lists with very little relevance to the craft. Maybe you're just one of those people who enjoy watching somebody talk about science fiction and retrofuturism. But if you are a creative like me, I want you to look at genres a bit differently. There is something I call the consumer fallacy. This is the presumption that a finished work of fiction is as intended from the beginning. In practice, creators are either brilliant because everything was master crafted to build its setting, characters and themes, or the creator was entirely incompetent. This fallacy ignores the creative process, the how and why decisions are made. Blade Runner, for example, is lauded for its lighting and its models, proving that Ridley Scott is a genius. But in fact, the creators added a lot of rain, shadow and night to hide how ugly the sets actually were. They took a chance, and now this type of lighting is a trope of the cyberpunk genre. And this is why so many Blade Runner imitators fail in what they try to achieve. That is the difference between working with flawed miniatures that break and have power cords running through them, and perfect rendered 3D environments where everything is as it ought to be. Flaws inspired creativity, whereas sterile environments are, well, just that, empty. The point is that all aesthetics came into being organically. If we want to discuss the differences between steampunk and dieselpunk, we need to look at the environment from which they sprung. Now for those new here, steampunk was a term created in the 1980s to describe the fictional genre by WWII. Soon people started using the punk adjective for anything, like dieselpunk, which was used to describe a 202 fantasy RPG I'm sure you've all played, Children of the Sun. A fantasy RPG that, according to one of the reviewers, was neither diesel nor punk. And its company and the game are both defunct, but I must admit I am somewhat curious to its contents, although I'm likely to be disappointed. But if somebody has a PDF copy for me, let me know. Were they really the first ones to use this term? No idea. Regardless, the term stuck around. But I rarely see the term being recognized outside of gaming. Important to mention here is that the book Jitter refers to were already published and the creators were already well established. It was conceived in a different age in which people created stuff first before declaring it a genre. These days everyone decided for themselves what they will write sometime in the future is so unique that it deserves to be its own category. Yes, one day the Association of Ishtar will too be recognized as the vanguard of a new genre of books and comics. Speaking of which, the Casket Girls will be out soon through Critical Blast. But I noticed another thing. Steampunk was recognized as a genre in the 1980s, dieselpunk in the early 2000s. Why the 20-year gap? Well, the same reason steampunk exploded in 2012. The early 2000s was the dawning of the Iron Age. the rise of independent creators. Before then, it was the great publishing houses who decided what was supposed to go to stores. This had to do with physical shelf space. If a store had a closet for fantasy and sci-fi, which is a big if, it may have had 6 shelves for subgenres, and that was it. That is why publishing houses were very selective in their franchises. At the dawn of the internet, for a long time, those publishers pretended it was business as usual. So, any artist who wanted to create something else had to publish independently. Before 2000, this was extremely difficult, but at the start of the Iron Age, you could enter the market just on the promise of making something new. This is how starved audiences were at the time. Fortunately, we know better now. But with more independent creators, there was also more competition. Ergo, many started coming up with new labels to stand out. Was this a smart strategy? Probably not. But it's time to talk Dieselpunk and how it relates to steampunk. In my previous video on Dieselpunk, which was a response to Tony Snipes, I talked about the influences of American pop culture on Dieselpunk. Since then, I pondered some more on the topic. In that video, I emphasized the difference in culture regarding the question on why Dieselpunk didn't catch on outside of the USA. The short answer: historically, the Americans look back on World War II with a sense of pride, whereas the Europeans look at the era with shame. But that's just one part of the story. The real answer was staring us in the face all along, and I feel a bit daft for not coming up with it before this. Steampunk tropes are heavily inspired, but not exclusively, on tropes from early European pop culture from circa 1900. Sherlock Holmes, Jack the Ripper, Queen Victoria, Verns, Wells, all stem from European traditions. Steampunk, being heavily influenced by contemporary geek culture, is a mix of old sci-fi tropes with modern media. If I would restrict steampunk to a period, it would be 1820s to 1920, because this is the era of European, but more importantly, British dominance. Not only did Britannia rule the waves, it was the period when Europe was at its cultural zenith. That changed after the First World War, which shattered Europe's self-image, and its empires went into decline, with the Second World War as its climax. What was left of these empires was soon destroyed or dissolved. It was after this period that America ceased to be the isolationist power. With the Russians expanding their influence in the eastern half of Europe and Asia, the Americans needed to promote their worldview as a counter to Soviet propaganda. The 1920s was also the boom of the American movie industry that in the 1930s attracted many German refugees fleeing Nazi rule, who would leave a lasting imprint on US culture. This became the era of film noir, detectives, weird fiction, and pulp comics, the most successful being The Shadow, who would inspire various imitators, like Batman. High on their victories in the First and Second World Wars, and the consequences of prohibition still fresh in the memory, America spread its cultural capital across the world through mass consumption. After all, Europe was in no position to produce anything, let alone new fictional franchises, and so the American view of history became predominant in the Western world, until the US started a bunch of military campaigns that damaged its reputation while China was on the rise, and Japanese animation and comics became increasingly popular. This is important because when you put the emergence of Dieselpunk in this time frame, the Japanese, being heavily influenced in prior period, already dealt a lot with German and Prussian aesthetics. This apparently had something to do with the German settlement in Japan, but the Japanese also hired a lot of Prussian military advisors during the Meiji Restoration. Point is, the Japanese used this archaic aesthetic a lot in their animes like Gundam from the 70s. Around this same time, an American filmmaker, heavily influenced by Japanese movies, made a little movie called Star Wars. And Lucas was also a big fan of directors like Fritz Lang and the documentary filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl, and French comics like those of Mobius, who I really should make a video on. German cinema overall had a massive influence upon America's cultures. Between Hitler's rise to power and the Cold War, many German architects, writers, and filmmakers fled to the States. Among people were expressionists like Fritz Lang and Raymond Chandler, who refined film noir, and the architects that inspired Streamline. Regardless, Lucas gave these tropes from various sources a very American twist and how its heroes behave, the values the good guys uphold, etc. I have made fun of people calling Star Wars dieselpunk, but they might have been on something there. It's kinda sad to see that a franchise that got its inspiration from this many creative sources became a self-referential meme, retreading the same old tropes over and over again without understanding where it all came from. In conclusion, I still insist that dieselpunk is an aesthetic. As a setting, for example, self-styled dieselpunk relies too heavily on the tropes of either sci-fi, fantasy, or post-apocalyptic fiction to have a distinct identity as a narrative genre. As alternate history, it's steampunk, with a lot of references to American pop culture and history. That's why it's hard to distinguish it from pulp fictions like Sky Captain, The Shadow, or Dick Tracy. As for the aesthetic side of things, I'll make its own video. But if you like homework, go watch our video on Streamline Modern and Art Deco, which coincidentally also contains many tips on how you can use these styles to enhance your own world building and setting. So I hope you found this informative. But before we sign off, a special thanks to our members on Ream, such as Asbeth and Miskatonic Librarian. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll bid you adieu, and as always, make things your way.